I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 11. First Strike. 20 miles off the coast of Long Island. The sky was gray and dark, almost as if Mother Nature knew that today was a grim day, a day that would shake the world to its core. Lieutenant Colonel Jean Pégu's flight of 4 Mirage 2000D aircraft from Fighter Squadron 2-3 Champagne were doing their best to slip undetected past the numerous American warplanes talking to the air. When they'd left Bagotville an hour ago, the war had only been minutes old. Now the sky above the United States was filling up with fighters and missiles from both sides. When his squadron had gone airborne, they'd broken down into 6 flights of 4. When they sought to penetrate American airspace, the other UN squadrons looked to create as much of a distraction as possible for them. It had been hoped, at least amongst the leading UN military commanders, that if they could land a decisive blow against the American government, they could get the remaining leaders to agree to end this war before it really got out of control. If things went according to plan, this fight could be over by the end of the day. If not, well then, it could drag on for a while longer. Looking at his instruments, Pégu confirmed that his altitude continued to hover around 20 meters above the water. Before they'd gone airborne, his flight had topped off their fuel tanks from a refueler. They'd dropped to treetop levels for the high-speed race across the American border to the ocean. Their initial flight plan took them across wooded forests as they made their way to Portland, Maine. As they got closer to the city, they shifted further away from the developed areas as they sought to avoid being spotted by civilians. When they made it past Portland, they flew away from land and began their long flight over the North Atlantic. His flight of 4 planes continued to skirt the coast, staying roughly 15 kilometers off the shore as they made their way down to Long Island, New York. Once they reached Long Island, they'd be in range to launch their Storm Shadow missiles at the American capital. If all went according to plan, they'd land a handful of these missiles into several high-value targets all along the East Coast. In one strike, they'd either decapitate the Sachs administration or send a powerful message to the political parties that they could be attacked, even at home. 40 minutes went by in relative calm. Their threat sensors hadn't detected any enemy aircraft or targeting radars being aimed at them. They detected a collection of search radars looking further inland, toward the Canadian border, but they hadn't been shifted to look out to sea. Presumably, the Americans didn't think the UN aircraft would attack from this angle. But those pompous Yankees were about to learn the hard way that they shouldn't underestimate the French Air Force. As they approached Long Island, Pégu saw that they'd just crept into range of their missiles. His flight of 4 aircraft was going to attack the American Capitol building. His second flight of 4 aircraft was going to target the Pentagon. His third, the CIA headquarters. His fourth, the NSA at Fort Meade. His fifth, 2 known Department of Defense buildings in Crystal City, right next to the Pentagon. And the last 2 missiles of that flight would target the White House. The 6th and last group was carrying the French-made MBDA Apache anti-runway cruise missiles. These 4 missiles were being targeted at the F-22 fighter wing that was now operating out of the old McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. These missiles would deploy a string of cluster munitions designed to disable the runways, thereby putting a severe dent in the American Air Force's ability to provide fighter cover for their ground forces along the Canadian border. Seeing that they were now in range of their missiles, Pegu sent a quick message to his flight mates. "We are going to fly another 5 minutes to get our missiles a little closer to the target before we launch. When you see me rise up to launch, follow suit. Once we release our weapons, follow me back to base on the flight plan we talked about earlier." He heard 3 separate radio chirps, letting him know they'd heard his instructions. They were doing their best to keep their radio chatter to a minimum to reduce the likelihood of them being detected. 5 more minutes went by before Pegu armed his cruise missile. He turned on its targeting computer and made sure it had established its satellite link and was ready to navigate its way to the target. Once he was satisfied that the missile was ready to fire, he pulled back on his controller, gaining enough altitude to release his weapon. The aircraft rose up. When he'd reached 200 meters above the water, he fired his lone missile. He felt the weight of the missile drop from his aircraft, staying at his current altitude just long enough to see the missile's engine ignite before it zoomed off to make history. With his missile away, he promptly dropped back down to 20 meters above the waves and turned to head back to Quebec. A warning flashed on Pegu's screen. A naval search radar had spotted them. "Damn, that's probably an Aegis destroyer," he thought. He didn't have much time to do anything about this new information. Less than 20 seconds later, alarm bells blared in Pegu's cockpit. Several missiles were headed their way. He switched on his electronic warfare pod and crossed his fingers, hoping that it would successfully jam the incoming missiles. "Light your afterburners and fly as close as possible to the water," he ordered. Maybe they could get the missiles to lose them in the ground clutter. Another warning alerted Pegu that the missile was now less than 10 seconds to impact. He broke hard to the right and climbed in altitude as fast as his aircraft would allow. All the while, his Mirage 2000D spat out countermeasures as his defensive systems tried their best to shake and confuse the incoming missile. Pegu heard a loud explosion down to his right. One of his flight mates' planes had exploded in a spectacular fireball. He didn't see a parachute. Without any time to process what had just happened, he banked hard to the left and dove back down toward the water. As he rapidly approached the water, he pulled up hard. His plane ejected a couple more countermeasures, and he felt the plane lurch forward a bit as one of the missiles that had been targeting him blew up behind him. Checking his gauges, Pegu breathed a sigh of relief when it didn't appear that he had sustained any damage. The immediate threats to his survival were now gone, but that Aegis system had reacquired him and fired off 2 more missiles in his direction. "I don't know if I'm going to make it out of this," he thought. A few more minutes went by as the American missiles tried to locate him in the clutter of the waves below, and eventually flew harmlessly past his plane. When his warning alarms stopped blaring, Pegu looked around to see how many of his comrades had made it out. Not being able to turn on his search radar meant he had to try and find them with his eyes. Eventually, he caught the glint of an aircraft off to his right and angled his plane toward it. It took him a minute, but he managed to locate his comrade. Sadly, the other 2 pilots appeared to have been lost. "I sure hope it was worth it," he thought glumly. Those guys were good friends of his. In solemn silence, he and his surviving comrade began their long trek back to Canadian airspace. Washington, D.C., Capitol Building. "What do you mean we have to evacuate the building?" demanded the newly elected Democratic Minority Leader, Jesus Perez. When the former Speaker of the House, Harriet Miller, had been ousted by the more radical wing of her party, Congressman Timothy Bork of New York had taken over as leader. But when he, along with 46 other Democratic congressmen and 26 Republican congressmen, had fled across the border to join the Tate administration in exile, the Democrats had elected Jesus Perez of Texas to take over as their new leader. However, with that many Democrats defecting, the Republican Party had regained control of the Congress by default. Those that were left in Congress saw the looming possibility of a civil war, and in an uncharacteristic move for the House of Representatives, they had tried to foster a spirit of unity and cooperation. Jesus had vowed that his wing of the Democratic Party would work toward developing a peaceful solution to this political impasse, and both parties were doing their best to reach across the aisle to keep the nation from being torn apart. Undeterred by his new position of power, the Secret Service agent who'd just explained the evacuation to him looked at Congressman Perez with a fierce determination. "Sir, the President has initiated the continuity of government. We need to get you to the helicopter now. We've been given orders to fly you, along with the other members of the government, to Mount Weather." Perez shook his head. "That fool Sachs is going to get us all killed if this conflict doesn't get resolved," he thought. "Fine, I'm coming," he said with a huff. "Lead the way, agent." He grabbed his overcoat and briefcase and followed the man out into the hallway, where he saw many of the other members of Congress filing out of the building. As he neared the outer doors, Congressman Perez heard a number of helicopters approaching. Once he was outside, Perez immediately observed that there were 4 Chinook helicopters landing at various positions on the park. Fortunately, there was no snow on the ground to make the already chaotic scene unfolding before his eyes any worse. The Secret Service agent who had been escorting him lightly grabbed him by the arm and proceeded to guide him toward the closest helicopter. Dozens of congressmen and women were running like their lives depended on it to the waiting helicopters and the soldiers waving them on. Suddenly, a loud wailing sound could be heard throughout the city. DC's emergency alarm system was going off. It was the same sound you'd typically hear if there was a tornado warning, only this was the middle of January. Abruptly, the Secret Service agent yelled at him, "Take cover!" The agent rushed them to the bottom of the stairs and then to the left so they could get next to the lower part of the promenade. Perez felt his heart race as he wondered what was going on. Then, over the roar of the helicopter rotor wash and the blaring emergency alarm, he heard the unmistakable sound of a rocket engine. As a military veteran who'd served in Afghanistan, that was a specific noise that he would never forget. A fast-moving object slammed into the side of the building where his office was located and blew up. The Secret Service agent threw him to the ground and placed his body on top of his as the ground and everything around them trembled violently from the explosion. Seconds after the first thunderous boom rocked Congressman Perez's world, a second and then a third explosion shook their very beings. In the flash of a second, the agent was back up on his feet, grabbing Perez by the back of his jacket. "Run to the helicopters!" he yelled. Congressman Perez barely had any time to even look around, and his only overriding thought now was to get the hell out of there. Despite being tunneled in on his destination, in his peripheral vision, Perez saw that one of the helicopters had been hit by some sort of debris and had blown up. There were injured people strewn all over the place. "I can't do anything about that right now," he realized. Fortunately, he could see that some of the nearby soldiers were helping the wounded up and bringing them to other helicopters that were still operational. More helicopters were flying toward them on the horizon to help with the evacuation. When the Secret Service agent reached the back of the Chinook, he practically threw Perez onto the helicopter. Then he ran off to go help some of the other injured congressmen. Now able to look back for the first time, the congressman saw where the 3 missiles had slammed into the Capitol building, blowing out large chunks of the iconic structure. Fire, papers, and debris floated back down to the ground. "Sweet Mary, we have to get out of here before we all die," he thought in horror. Turning to try and find the crew chiefs, Perez saw that they were still outside the big helicopter, loading more people onto it. He made a beeline to the front of the Chinook, where the pilots were. Sticking his head into the cockpit, he yelled, "I'm the Democratic Minority Leader. You need to get us the hell out of here before the rest of us are killed." The 2 pilots looked at him, fear and anxiety written on their faces. The older pilot just nodded. He must have said something over his radio because a moment later, the 2 crew chiefs ran back on board and the helicopter engines picked up speed. A minute later, the Chinook lifted off, not quite full. Perez didn't care. In that moment, he'd realized he was too important to stay there waiting for a few more people to get on board and risking the helicopter he was on getting blown up. When the helicopter had gained enough altitude for him to see more of the city, his heart sank. Not only had the capital been hit, he saw huge plumes of smoke emanating from the Pentagon and 2 buildings over in Crystal City. When the Chinook turned around, his view changed to show the White House. Miraculously, it looked like the building had survived unscathed, with the exception of what appeared to be a direct hit to the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door. A hole in that part of the building had thick black smoke billowing out of what was now a massive, charred ruin. Congressman Perez felt rage well up inside him as he wondered how those who defected could attack the country so blatantly. Senator Tate's taken this too far, he thought in horror. The next 60 minutes went by in a blur and a state of shock for each of the members of Congress who had made it onto the helicopter. They had no idea how many of their fellow legislators had survived, but one thing was certain. Whatever cajoling Senator Tate thought he could do to help oust President Sachs was over. The country would now rally behind the president. 20,000 feet above Buffalo, New York. Major Dieter Grefe of the German 74th Tactical Air Force Wing heard the warning alarm blaring in his ear for the 4th time in 5 minutes. I can't think with that stupid woman yelling in my ear, he thought, as the female voice warned him of another missile warning. He summarily switched the alarm off. He banked his aircraft hard into another tight corkscrew as a missile streaked right past him. Then he hit his thruster and pulled hard into another turn, just as a string of tracer fire flew right across his canopy. Then he did something remarkable and unexpected. He hit his air brakes, dropping his speed until he was nearly in a stall. If his pursuer was using his guns on him, that meant the guy was practically right behind him. A fraction of a second after he did his maneuver, the American F-15E that had just been on his tail moments before flew right past him. He could tell the American pilot was caught off guard because he instantly lit up his afterburners, trying to add as much distance and speed between them as possible. Closing his air brakes, Dieter lit his afterburner. He switched from missiles to guns and depressed the trigger. A string of 27mm rounds from his Mauser BK-27 cannon reached out and slammed into the right wing and engine of the American aircraft as it desperately tried to get away from him. The F-15's wing ripped clean off from the G-forces of the tight, high-speed turn its pilot was trying to make to escape Dieter's cannon fire. Next, its engine caught fire, and the plane now spiraled into a flaming circle. A second later, the canopy of the F-15 blew clear of the aircraft as the pilot and his backseater were blown out of the plane, their chutes deploying seconds later. With the immediate threat neutralized, Dieter looked around for the next enemy aircraft and reset his controls. Seconds later, his alarm blared again in his ear. Warning, warning, warning. Where did he come from? Dieter thought angrily. He cursed as a missile appeared behind him. Unfortunately, he had no time to react, and the projectile slammed into his Eurofighter. Suddenly, all of his instruments flashed red. The female warning voice now shouted, "Eject! Eject! Eject!" Here goes the neighborhood, he thought. Then he pulled the handle. Fractions of a second later, his canopy blew off and he was shot out of his flaming jet, only to see it explode seconds later. His chute hadn't even deployed when his plane exploded below him. Had he waited even a fraction of a second longer to eject, he'd have been blown apart with his aircraft. Looking around him, Dieter caught a glimpse of what appeared to be an F-22 as it zipped past him, seeking out more of his comrades to shoot down. Seeing that he couldn't do anything more to contribute to the fight, Dieter looked around to see where he was. At this altitude, he had a good view of the ground below. It looked like he was still somewhere over the city of Buffalo. He did his best to angle himself away from the city so he wouldn't get tangled up in the tall buildings. He knew he was too far away to float back into Canadian territory. His best bet now was to land in a farm field and do his best to hide or make his way back to the border. For now, his part in the war was over, and that thoroughly frustrated him. 20,000 feet above Buffalo, New York. Lieutenant Colonel Jeb Trace of the 43rd Fighter Squadron smiled with satisfaction when he saw the German Eurofighter blow up. That was his third kill in the last 10 minutes. At this rate, he'd be an ace in a few more minutes. Damn, if those Europeans aren't trying hard to kill us, he thought angrily. He couldn't believe that it had come down to this. Just 6 years ago, he'd been stationed at Spangdahlem Air Force Base in Germany. He'd trained with many of the very same pilots that were now trying to kill him and his fellow countrymen. Colonel Trace radioed back to his AWACS support a few hundred miles further back. Without his eye in the sky, the fighters of his squadron were essentially flying blind. "Badger 1, this is Hornet 1. I need a target," he said. "Hornet Flight, be advised that we're tracking 4 potential F-35s heading toward your location," the battle manager responded. "We're doing our best to get a solid lock on them. We're going to start mirroring our radar screens to you now. We'll vector you guys in to get closer to them, and then go active with your radars for missile lock." A few seconds later, Trace's radar screen showed him 4 soft blips that were believed to be the F-35s. Since these were American-made fighters, they knew precisely what radar frequencies to use to get a better lock on them. However, they'd have to get within 20 miles before they could activate their own search radars. It was a risky move, but they needed to clear the skies of these threats. Otherwise, the EU F-35s would tear up the F-15 and F-16 fighters that were going after the enemy SAMs and providing ground support to the army below. "Listen up, guys," said Lieutenant Colonel Trace over their close-in communication system. "This is going to be a tough fight, but we have to clear the skies of these F-35s. We've trained against F-35s in the past, so let's put that training to good use and show these assholes that no one messes with America." It took them 5 minutes to reposition themselves over southern Canada to get themselves prepared to launch their attack. When they'd gotten themselves to within 20 miles of the small group of F-35s, they turned their active radars on, and sure enough, within the first radar sweep, all 4 of them lit up like Christmas trees. Trace's flight of 4 F-22s fired off their AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles at their unsuspecting foes. Their prey immediately took evasive maneuvers as their suite of electronic defensive measures went into overdrive, spitting out countermeasures and doing their best to jam their missiles. Several of their missiles flew after the countermeasures, and others missed their marks entirely from all the jamming. Trace's flight of F-22s fired off another volley of missiles. This time they opted to use their AIM-9 Sidewinders, as they had finally gotten within knife range of the F-35s. From further away, it was a fairly even fight, but that close, their F-22s could easily outmaneuver the F-35s. Now that they knew their stealth cover had been blown, the Belgian fighters activated their radars and returned fire with their own missiles. For the next 10 minutes, the two sides began a deadly aerial dance of firing missiles and shooting their onboard cannons at each other, both without a lot of initial success. Soon, a second group of American F-22s showed up to join the fray. At that point, the tide definitely turned, and all 4 F-35s were shot down. Unfortunately, they'd succeeded in downing 2 Raptors in the process. The next several hours would see some of the most intense aerial combat of modern warplanes since the Battle of Britain, with both sides dueling it out with their 4th and 5th generation fighters. The United States seemed to be gaining an edge in the fighting, but they were certainly taking a beating. Goodell's, Michigan, Goodell's County Park. The sky was dark and ominous. Gray clouds had crept in, obscuring what had looked like a beautiful day when the dawn had first broken through the darkness of the night. Now it looked almost like it might threaten them with snow, judging by the dark bellies of the clouds. Then again, it was January in northeastern Michigan, a part of the state that often received heavy amounts of snow in the winter. so this wasn't anything new. Brushing aside his concern for what the weather might hold, Sergeant First Class Riley looked to his right and left. He saw that his platoon of soldiers from the 1st Squadron 9th Cavalry Regiment was about as ready as they were going to be for whatever was coming toward them. They were spread out every couple of meters, sporting their winter camouflage outerwear over their standard-issue universal camouflage pattern uniforms. None of them were thrilled about being deployed to Michigan in the dead of winter, let alone the possibility that they might actually have to fight in the cold and snowy weather of the upper Midwest. But here they were, tricked out in their winter gear, doing their best not to overexpose themselves, and preparing to ambush whatever enemy unit was heading toward them. When they'd first reached this position, roughly an hour ago, they were all still wrapping their heads around the reports that a German-Dutch military unit had crossed the St. Clair River. Then they'd heard the aerial dance of death taking place high above them as fighters from both sides fought for supremacy of the battle space. There was no way to know from the ground who was winning that fight, but they certainly saw and heard a lot of explosions happening high above them. They even spotted a few parachutes descending back to Earth as they watched some of the fiery wrecks spin out of control before exploding on the ground. Despite their personal misgivings at what they were being told by their officers and NCOs, the fighting taking place in the sky above them made one thing abundantly clear. Whatever hope there was for a peaceful solution had apparently been dashed. Now it was time to prepare to meet the enemy and send them back across the border. Once his platoon and squadron had deployed to their blocking positions, scattered on either side of Interstate 69, all Sergeant Riley could do was sit and wait. 60 long minutes went by as the tension and anticipation of the unknown wore on their emotions. After what felt like forever, Riley heard a sound that was unmistakable. The metallic clanking gave away a tracked vehicle as it traveled down the paved road in their direction. Steadily, the sound grew louder. His pulse raced as his blood was flooded with adrenaline. The sense of fear and excitement only continued to build. While he couldn't see what was heading toward them yet, he felt the ground quiver a bit as the sound of tank tracks echoed through the barren woods and the surrounding area. The soldiers of Riley's platoon all knew this sound well, and it could only mean one thing. An armored vehicle that wasn't American was heading toward them. "Here they come!" shouted Sergeant Mendoza over the radio to the rest of the squadron. Mendoza and 2 other privates had set up a listening and observation post about 50 meters in front of their position, so they'd have eyes on the vehicles first. Riley signaled with his hands to the javelin crew just a few meters away from him to get ready. The soldiers manning the anti-tank guided missile nodded in acknowledgement and looked through the optical sights, lining the missile up on the target they wanted to destroy. "Steady. Wait for it," whispered Riley over the platoon net. He knew as soon as he yelled fire, all hell would break loose and it'd be game on. Seeing the armored vehicle come around a slight bend in the road, he felt his stomach tighten with fear and excitement. This wasn't like Iraq or Afghanistan, where he had first cut his teeth in combat. This was a battle against a fellow professional army, one he had trained and fought with as an ally in Afghanistan. When the vehicle finally reached their pre-identified kill box, he depressed the radio talk button, talking just above a whisper. "Fire." Poop. Swoosh! 2 Javelin anti-tank missiles shot out of their tubes and instantly took off for their targets, a German Leopard 2 tank and the Marder directly behind it. The tank was the lead vehicle in a 5-vehicle convoy. Along with the tank and the Marder were 3 Fuchs armored personnel carriers. This was clearly a heavy scout element for a much larger force still further back. Seconds after the dismounted American soldiers fired their missiles, the 30mm Bushmaster guns on their nearby Stryker vehicles fired a string of rounds at the 3 enemy armored personnel carriers. Each of those vehicles could carry 10 infantry soldiers. So if they could take them out now, that would be 30 enemy soldiers out of the fight. At lightning speed, the javelins crossed the 400 meters of distance and slammed into the Leopard and Martyr before the drivers or their commanders even had time to respond to the attack. When the first missile hit the tank, the Leopard's reactive armor detonated as it was designed to do, barely saving the crew. The driver of the tank fell back on his training and automatically popped their IR smoke canisters as he deftly gunned the engine and steered the tank off the road. They were clearly trying to get out of their line of sight before they got hit with another missile. As they drove off the road, past the ditch and into the wooded area to the right, the tank commander turned the turret in the direction of Sergeant Riley and his men. The javelin that had been aimed at the Martyr scored a direct kill shot. The shaped charge exploded through the reactive armor as the second charge blew into the troop compartment. The detonation of the second charge inside the vehicle caused a massive overpressure inside the sealed compartment, and the top hatches blew open, releasing a short jet of fire as the ammunition and anti-tank missiles inside cooked off. The vehicle ground to a halt in the middle of the road and then summarily blew up. One of the German Fuchs APCs swerved to try to avoid getting hit with more rounds before it crashed into a tree on the side of the road. The Stryker continued to light the troop compartment up with 30mm rounds in an effort to slaughter its human cargo before they could get out. The other Fuchs saw what was happening and immediately drove off the road to the left and popped a series of smoke grenades to obscure the Americans' view. When the two remaining vehicles stopped, their human cargo of soldiers piled out of the rear and hunted for targets to shoot at. "Light 'em up!" yelled Sergeant Riley over the company net. Riley and his men opened fire on the unsuspecting Germans with their M4s and M240G machine guns, sending a wall of lead at the enemy soldiers. Red tracer fire raked the German positions as the Americans laid into them. The rest of the American 16 Stryker vehicles also joined the fray with their M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns, their 30mm chain guns, and 2 Mark 19 automatic grenade guns, showering the enemy soldiers with an unbearable amount of withering gunfire. Pop! Swoosh! A third javelin flew out of their lines and went straight for the German tank that was doing its best to help its countrymen and kill the missile crews that were still gunning for them. The tank's main gun leveled at the center of the American lines for the briefest of seconds before it belched smoke and flame. Boom! Bam! A clump of trees, dirt, and underbrush exploded when the nearby Stryker vehicle blew apart. Several other soldiers close to it screamed out in pain as they were hit by the hot shards of flaming shrapnel and debris, adding to the chaos erupting all around them. A second later, the javelin crossed the distance between the two warring factions and slammed into the rear side compartment of the tank. This time the warhead punched right through the reactive armor, shooting its jet of fire and molten copper directly into the engine and ammunition compartments of the tank. The fuel tanks and ammunition locker instantly ignited and exploded in spectacular fashion. Flames shot up into the sky as the ammunition locker's blowout doors released the force of its contents up and away from the crew compartment. The entire back half of the tank completely blew apart. Shocked and disoriented, the Germans who hadn't been killed outright tried to return fire and organize themselves as best they could. While the Americans thought they had the Germans pinned down, one of their Stryker vehicles exploded in a massive fireball, throwing several nearby soldiers to the ground and hitting many more with shrapnel. Then a second, third, and fourth Stryker blew up before they even knew what was hitting them. The remaining American vehicles didn't wait to find out where this new threat was coming from. They blew their own infrared smoke screens and started shuffling around for a better concealed position, while the 4 anti-tank crews swung their javelins around to deal with this new threat. On a hill crest a couple of kilometers away from the ensuing battle, Lieutenant Colonel Jeremy Kilgore watched as one of his squadrons caught a German scout unit by complete surprise. As he observed the battle unfolding, the sounds of war saturated the area. The popping sounds of M4s, The heavy reports of the 50 caliber machine guns and the rat-a-tats of the M240G light machine guns were intermixed with the heavier bass sounds of the 30mm chain guns reverberating throughout the area. 3 hours ago, before the war had officially started, Kilgore's regiment had been deployed to a campground near the small town of Emmett, just off Interstate 69. This placed them somewhat close to the U.S.-Canadian border without putting them in a city. Up until a few hours ago, everyone in the regiment had been of the mind that this was all a show of force, that somehow, someway, calmer heads would triumph, and this UN force on the other side of the border wasn't actually going to invade. The prevailing thought amongst his unit was that enough people would have seen the 1980s movie Red Dawn to realize that the heavily armed populace of America wouldn't tolerate a foreign army on its soil. Clearly, that logic hadn't won the day. When the first shots of the war had been fired, Kilgore's scout platoon had been watching the U.S.-Canadian border in a state of anxious boredom. It had been a huge shock when they'd received word over the radio that a Dutch or German Special Forces unit had taken over the Blue Water Bridge before the platoon of engineers could blow it up. The whole capture had happened so fast they couldn't do anything to intervene, and soon a large column of German and Dutch armored vehicles and infantry soldiers had bum-rushed the bridge. At that point, the 9th Cavalry Regiment was ordered to set up a blocking force on both sides of Interstate 69 around Goodell's, while the rest of the brigade moved forward to assist them. Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore had been zeroed in on the action taking place below him when he heard a noise to his left. To his surprise, Kilgore saw a couple of civilian vehicles driving up the hill where he was situated. A group of 8 lightly armed citizens, wearing hunting camo, got out of their vehicles and pointed in the direction of the battle unfolding in their sleepy little country town. Before they could even walk over to him and his headquarters staff, Kilgore turned to his operations officer and barked, "Get those civilians out of here! Tell them to go back to their homes and hide their weapons. I don't want them needlessly getting killed." He then turned his back on them and returned his attention to the battle still raging. Just as he turned to look at his soldiers fighting it out with this lead German element, they heard a new sound pierce the battle space. There was a sharp crack, followed by the boom of a tank gun. The first sound was followed by 3 more in rapid succession. To his horror, Kilgore saw 4 German main battle tanks that must have been traveling along the frontage road of I-69 veer off the 2-lane road and begin to race through an open farm field toward his troopers. A second volley of red-hot rounds raced from their tank barrels right for his troops, hitting them with devastating effect. Colonel Kilgore turned to his radioman. "Get me our aviation support, now!" The young soldier handed him the radio handset a second later. "I've got them," he said. Kilgore grabbed the radio. "Arrow 2-2, this is Dark Horse 6. I've got 4 German tanks hitting my right flank. I need air support ASAP," he shouted. While he was talking, the German tanks fired another volley into his soldiers, and 2 more of his strikers went up in smoke. In response, a lone missile flew out from one of the Javelin crews toward the enemy tanks. 2 of the German tanks fired off smoke canisters to try and confuse the missile's IR tracking sensor, and they swerved to one side. The missile just missed its target at the last second. "Copy that, Dark Horse. Arrow 2-2 is engaging now," replied the Apache pilot. Kilgore could hear his rotor blades and other electronics in the background as the pilot spoke. In the distance, not too far away, Colonel Kilgore could hear the sound of helicopter blades getting closer. A second later, 4 Hellfire missiles streaked across the sky over their position on the hill toward the enemy tanks, flying right through the enemy smoke screen to slam right into the tanks. Boom, 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 boom. All 4 enemy tanks blew up, and the attack on his flank ended as swiftly as it had started. Scanning back to where his soldiers were, Colonel Kilgore sadly saw 8 burning wrecks that had once been striker vehicles. Looking toward the enemy positions, he also saw several new black smudges and a few new explosions as the Apaches now flew ahead of his position, engaging whatever enemy vehicles and units they spotted just over the horizon. "Go get 'em, boys," he thought. Just as he was starting to feel good about the situation, or at least like they were getting the upper hand in this tug of war, both Apaches exploded in midair. A second later, a sleek-looking fighter plane with black iron crosses on it flew fast and low over their position before banking hard to the north as it sought to gain more altitude. "Holy crap! They just took out our helicopter, sir!" shouted the radioman incredulously, shock and horror written all over his face. "Get me brigade!" yelled Kilgore. Changing to the brigade frequency, the soldier handed him the hand receiver again. "Stable 6, Dark Horse 6. I just lost both of my Apaches to a pair of German fighters. We need fighter cover from the Air Force, now!" He hoped someone with more rank on their collar than him could get him some higher-level support. If the Germans had fighter support, they'd make short work of the rest of his regiment. 30 seconds went by before he heard a response. "Dark Horse 6, Stable 6, that's a good copy. I've relayed your request to our forward air controller. They've got fighters inbound to our AOR. I'm retasking additional helicopter support to you now. We've got a sizable German unit moving out of Port Huron toward you. I need you to hold your current position for a little while longer. Is that understood?" Colonel Kilgore shook his head in frustration. He'd just lost more than half a squadron, and now he had an unknown German force headed toward him? He needed more information on that. "That's a good copy. Be advised, I just lost half of a squadron's worth of soldiers and vehicles. I need additional support if I'm to hold this position." Another minute went by. Presumably, Brigade was looking at the bigger picture, trying to see what forces they had that could be shifted around to help him out. Then the radio crackled for a second and beeped as the sync guards finally synced. "I know you're in a tough spot, Kilgore, but we're getting hit all across our lines right now. The best I can do for support is shift a battery of guns from the 16th Field Artillery Regiment. Do what you can, and report back if it looks like the Germans are going to break through your position. Out." And with that, Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore was on his own. How big is this force heading toward us? He wondered. Shaking his head, he looked at his radio operator. "Give me 5th Squadron." A minute later, he had his tank squadron commander on the radio. "Hammer 6, Dark Horse 6. I need you to shift your tanks over to grid MI 5768, 5786, and be prepared to deal with enemy tanks. We just got hit by a platoon of Leopard 2s. Stable 6 said we have a large German force headed to our position along I-69. I need you to move ASAP and get ready to deal with them," he said. "Copy that. We're on the move." A moment later, Kilgore heard from one of the 6 scout units he had scattered in front of their positions. "Dark Horse 6, this is Watcher 2. We've got what appears to be 2 companies' worth of tanks moving down either side of I-69 toward your position, and those 4 tanks you guys blew up earlier. Estimate their arrival in 10 mics. We've also spotted another column moving up Lapeer Road to your north. We are relocating to alternate site, Delta. Out." Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore wished they could have had more scout units. Maybe we could have spotted that first platoon of German tanks and called in helicopter support earlier, he thought. Looking at the map of where Watcher 2 was located, he saw they were in a good position to call in some artillery support on at least 2 of the German columns. With the armored force still 4 miles away, he really wanted to start getting some steel on them quickly. Seemingly sensing exactly what Kilgore was thinking, his operations officer opined, "We could try and call in an artillery strike on those positions. At least let them know we've spotted them. Maybe it'll cause them to advance a little slower and give us more time to get our own tanks in position." Turning to look at the captain, Kilgore nodded. "Get back on the horn with Watcher 2. and see if they can relay some coordinates for the artillery. See if you can't disrupt their movement while we wait on getting some additional gunship support from brigade. For the next 20 minutes, a near continuous roar of artillery rounds flew over their heads toward the enemy, and then they heard counter-battery fire as the Germans tried to locate and take out his artillery support. The artillery duel continued until the whistling and rumbling of the rounds pounding the earth was joined by the metal clanking of his tanks and the German tanks traveling toward each other. The two sides continued their long-range duel with each other as they sought to maneuver around each other for a better angle of attack. Interspersed with the artillery and tank fire was the growing crescendo of small arms fire as the APCs and infantry fighting vehicles ferried the German infantry soldiers closer to his own. As the battle grew, it became clear that Kilgore's men were most likely facing a substantially larger force than they'd first thought. More and more enemy tanks and armored vehicles continued to show up, probing around his flanks and looking for spots to punch through and encircle them. The radio crackled and then beeped, letting them know the encrypted radio had synced. Dark Horse 6, Stable 6. I need you to begin a tactical withdrawal to the K-Pac rest stop. It's roughly 16 miles behind your current position. I've got most of the brigade moved up to that spot. We're going to try and organize a counterattack once you pass through our lines. Finally, some good news, Colonel Kilgore thought, letting out a deep breath. Copy that. Out. He was more than happy to get out of Dodge. With their new orders, Kilgore sent out the word to his squadrons to fall back to their new coordinates. Now comes the fun part, Kilgore realized. Disengaging from an enemy that was determined to kill you was easier said than done. K-Pac rest stop. Colonel Chris Compton of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 1st Cavalry Division, cursed at the situation he now found himself in. Somehow, he had to do his best to stop this German horde that had crossed into Michigan. His intelligence group had said they were facing the 10th Panzer Division and elements of the division's Schnellkräfte. These were the Germans' crack armor and airborne divisions. This meant his meager brigade of 4,500 soldiers was stuck facing down 25,700 Dutch and German soldiers until the rest of the division came online. Colonel Compton examined the map again and swore. How the hell am I supposed to stop 2 freaking divisions of troops with a brigade? He thought. If General Potts didn't get the rest of the division up there ASAP, he and his men were going to be nothing more than a speed bump. The chaos around him didn't help him to stay calm. Even though the brunt of the fighting was 16 miles to their front, the sounds of war still reached them. The nearly constant thumping of artillery rounds from the regiment of artillery to their rear was making itself known to the enemy. The counter-battery fire was forcing his artillery regiment to change positions every couple of shots. From time to time, a loud explosion could be heard, as one of their M109 Paladin self-propelled vehicles or one of the ammo carriers took a hit. High overhead, he heard the screaming of fighters dueling it out in the skies above them, adding to his anxiety of not even having solid air support to rely on. With a squadron of A-10 Warthogs, they could make short work of this German unit, but not with Eurofighters smothering the skies above them. He was lucky they weren't pounding his own positions yet. "Sir, it looks like Kilgore's regiment is coming in," said Colonel Compton's XO. He handed him a pair of binoculars and pointed down the 2 frontage roads on either side of I-69. Taking the field glasses, Compton looked down the road and saw Kilgore's ragtag force. Several of his tanks had their turrets facing behind them while their smoke generators were going. The tanks were doing their best to screen for the Strykers, Bradleys, and other vehicles that were trying to beat feet back to his lines. Compton knew that not far behind them was a much larger armor force, ginning up for a fight. Kilgore's regiment had bloodied them up, but now they were looking for revenge. Colonel Compton handed the binoculars back to his XO. "Send a message back to Warhorse Actual and ask him what his ETA is," he ordered. "Ask him he wants us to fall back to position Gulf." 5 minutes went by as his XO went back and forth with division, trying to figure out exactly where the rest of the other brigades were and if they should try and hold their position for a few hours or fall back now before they were fully engaged. Part of the problem with allowing a force to make contact was trying to break contact later on. Disengaging from a determined enemy was not an easy feat. Before his brigade became bogged down, Colonel Compton wanted to know if help was only a few hours away or if they were looking at a day or two on their own. If it was the latter, then they'd carry out a fighting retreat rather than try and stand and fight. Maneuver warfare was the best option when outnumbered and outgunned. Saginaw, Michigan, City Hall. Mayor Peter Russo stared at the police chief for a second as he tried to take in what he had just heard. "You're saying the UN force across the border has not only invaded, but they've captured Port Huron?" he asked incredulously. "Yes, Mr. Mayor, that is exactly what I'm saying. My nephew is a captain in the National Guard. He told me the regular army is going to fight it out in Detroit, but aside from the city, they're going to conduct a fighting retreat south. That means the rest of us up north are going to have to fend for ourselves." The fire chief chimed in. "So we're on our own then?" "It would appear so," the police chief replied glumly. Mayor Russo knew the situation was serious, but a part of him felt like this might be his moment to shine. He remembered watching that movie Red Dawn about Cuban and Russian soldiers parachuting into a western town and trying to take it over. He specifically thought of the scene where the scared kids had stopped at one of their dad's sporting goods stores on the way out of town, and the man had given them all the rifles, ammo, bows and arrows he could. Russo knew he could do the same. "Okay, listen up, people," the mayor announced. His voice was loud enough that it caused everyone to pipe down and focus on him. "Here's what we're going to do. For the time being, we're on our own, but that doesn't mean we're defenseless. While some may welcome the UN as liberators, I, for one, do not. This is America, and we govern ourselves." Mayor Russo pointed at Chief Ryan. "I want you to find all the records of people who personally own a firearm, either at the police station or the individual gun stores and sporting goods stores, and I want them destroyed. We're not going to let these so-called peacekeepers know who in our community is armed so they can arrest them. Second, I want all the gun and sporting stores to work with you on handing out all the firearms and ammo you can to volunteers to defend the city. If the Guard and the Army are going to leave us to fend for ourselves, then by God, that's exactly what we'll do." As the group continued to talk about what they could do to defend their town, the police chief got an urgent call over the radio. "Chief Ryan, this is Patrol 5. I've got a visual on 8 military vehicles heading toward town. What do you want us to do?" called one of the police officers. The radio crackled again before Ryan could respond. Yeah, this is Patrol 8. I'm out near the airport and I'm seeing hundreds of paratroopers landing. I don't think they're Americans. What do you want me to do?" The room suddenly became quiet as all eyes turned to the chief and the mayor. "Order him to pull back to the edge of town," said Mayor Russo. "Everyone else, grab a firearm and let's set up some sort of ambush for them when they enter town." Everyone but Ryan got up without hesitation and headed toward the door. The chief depressed the talk button on his radio, connecting him with the police station dispatcher. "Shirley, tell Captain Lacey to grab every rifle, shotgun, pistol, and all our ammo and head over to City Hall. We're going to arm our citizens with everything we have. If things work out, We'll ambush these foreign invaders, and then we'll be able to steal their weapons." The next 20 minutes were tense. The city government used the alert system that was normally activated for an Amber Alert to notify the citizens of Saginaw of the coming foreign attack. The message asked anyone with a firearm to report to City Hall and requested that all others lock their doors and remain inside. As the armored vehicles approached the outskirts of Saginaw, Chief Ryan began to receive reports from the field on his radio. "Sir, the UN vehicles have stopped and seem to be surveying the scene. They've definitely spotted the roadblock." Several citizens had parked their cars and trucks across the main roads in an attempt to slow or stop the invaders. "Stay the course," Chief Ryan ordered. A few minutes went by in anxious expectation. "Sir, they're moving forward now." The silent anticipation was broken by the sounds of gunfire. "Chief, we've got several of the armed citizens shooting at the vehicles with their hunting rifles. Unfortunately, the bullets are bouncing off the armor." "Well, at least they should be receiving the message that they aren't welcome here," Ryan replied. "The armored vehicles have successfully pushed aside the roadblock, sir," his man on the ground announced. The chief could still hear the occasional gunshot, but they seemed further away. The defenders must have retreated to the homes and vehicles nearby, just taking shots of opportunity as they were able. "Sir, the convoy has stopped. They're dismounting their infantry." The battle for Saginaw, Michigan, population 196,542, had begun, and so had the battle for the heartland of America. New York-Quebec border, town of Chateauguay. General de Brigade Joseph Joffre hoped the politicians knew what they were doing. His brigade was about to cross the proverbial Rubicon, from which there was no returning. No nation had ever invaded America and come close to achieving any sort of victory. His superiors had told him that this was not an invasion, but a liberation, with widespread support from within. "Well, we'll see if that's true in about 5 minutes," he thought. The sky above them was silent, almost peaceful. However, the rumbling of nearly 1,200 vehicle engines that had just started broke through any sense of calm. The 8,000 French soldiers of the French 7th Armored Brigade were ready to roll. The UN operation to remove President Sachs from power was no longer a tabletop exercise. It was now a real military operation, with real lives and military equipment involved. Intermixed with their armored force were roughly 2,000 New York Civil Defense Force soldiers. These newly created American militia units would help the UN force to support their narrative that they were not an invading army, but rather liberators, working with Americans to help remove a tyrannical dictator. The militiamen's native English skills and knowledge of the area would serve Joffre far more than any limited military capability they might possess. As such, he had them thoroughly integrated with all his units to provide the public interface with the civilian populace when the time came. As his column of vehicles moved across the border, Joffre had his scout units begin to fan out. Their intelligence unit said there was an American brigade operating in the area, so the French general sent his 42 Panhard Véhicules Blindés Légers scout vehicles, or VBLs, to fan out and smoke them out. Truth be told, it was an American battalion, not a brigade. The American force was scattered across much of upstate New York and parts of Vermont, so Joffre wasn't facing a full American brigade. Nonetheless, he wanted to find them and destroy them quickly so he could advance down the state and liberate New York City, which was his primary objective. 10 minutes after his first regiment had crossed the American border, his own command vehicle finally reached the Customs and Border Protection building. It was incredibly odd to see this usually busy location, where officials would regularly search vehicles and trucks crossing back and forth across the border, reduced to a ghost town. However, it occurred to Joffre that the structure could give him some strategic advantage, at least for the time being. "Seize the building," General Joffre ordered. "We are going to turn this into a forward command post, at least until the rest of our unit is further into the state." Once the building had been cleared and secured, Joffre went to work making himself at home. One of the first orders of business was getting the maps set up with the various regiments' positions. Next, his reconnaissance unit began launching their scout drones to help in the search to find these vaunted American units. In a few minutes, his staff was able to make contact with the Air Force squadron assigned to support his force, making sure they had ground support should they need it. Steadily, things were starting to shape up. It began to look as if they were going to have an easy go of capturing New York City. That was, until they received a frantic call across the radio. Joffre's lead units had finally made contact with the enemy. Now it was time to fix them to their position and let the Air Force pound them while his armor shifted around their flanks and destroyed them. Lieutenant Tom Boyette of the 2nd Battalion, 14th Infantry Regiment watched as the first enemy scout vehicle passed through their kill box. It took a lot of willpower not to open fire and smoke 'em, but his platoon sergeant had insisted that if they let the scout vehicle through, they'd be rewarded with a much more tempting target to blow up and save their element of surprise. It was one of the best tactical advantages they had. Even though it was winter in upstate New York, that didn't mean they couldn't conceal their positions well. They had various winter camouflage nets set up at different angles to break up the silhouettes of their vehicles, and at the moment, they were all but invisible. Boyette and his platoon sergeant were under no illusion about their prospects in this fight. They had to hit the enemy fast and hard, and then do their best to pull a Houdini and slip away to fight another day. Their unit's orders were to carry out hit-and-run attacks on the French force until the rest of their battalion could maneuver around to meet them. Nearly 10 minutes went by before they saw their first real target rolling down Country Road 11, a column of 6 VAB armored personnel carriers supported by 4 AMX-10 RC vehicles, which were light reconnaissance vehicles that packed a 105mm cannon. This group looked to be about a company-strength level unit. It was precisely the type of target they'd been waiting for. Turning to look at his platoon sergeant, Lieutenant Boyette nodded, knowing the sergeant would make sure the platoon did what they were supposed to do. Boyette's platoon had set up 4 Javelin ATGMs, and 2 of their striker vehicles had been outfitted with their own 105mm cannons. 2 of the 4 JLTVs they had with them were set up with the venerable M2 50 caliber machine guns, while the other 2 had the M240 light machine guns in their turrets. They also had the only 105mm cannon equipped with strikers in the company, which meant they packed most of their unit's firepower. For a small platoon, they packed a big punch. Pop, swoosh, pop, swoosh, boom, boom! The surreal scene of silence and peacefulness was instantly shattered as the javelins shot across the 300 meters of distance toward the French recce vehicles. "Fire!" shouted one of the sergeants in the turret section of the striker. Boom, boom, bam, bam. The 2 strikers fired their 105mm rounds right into 2 of the 6 APCs, blowing both vehicles completely over onto their sides and off the road as they erupted into flames. The crews in both strikers scrambled to reload the 105mm cannon so they could take out the next 2 vehicles. Several voices yelled out in French, barking orders to their men as they sought to react to the American ambush. "Let 'em have it," shouted Boyette over the platoon net. The two M250 caliber machine guns on the JLTVs opened fire on the remaining French armored personnel carriers. Unfortunately, hitting them would be a little harder because they had popped off some smoke grenades to obscure the view and were doing their best to find a concealed position on the side of the road. Around 20 of Boyette's infantrymen also opened fire on the soldiers that were spilling out of the two APCs that hadn't been hit. 10 seconds after the fight started, 2 more cannons opened fire, hitting the last 2 APCs and turning them into charred ruins. The few enemy soldiers that survived continued to fire back at the Americans, doing their best to lay down covering fire for their own comrades. Seeing their work there was done, Lieutenant Boyette yelled over the platoon net, "It's time to saddle up and bug out." They needed to get out of there and fall back to their secondary position before reinforcements showed up. Tampa, Florida, U.S. Special Operations Headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Seth Mitchell kissed his wife and his 2 kids goodbye, not knowing exactly how long he'd be gone. After a tumultuous deployment to Kosovo in late October and early November, he'd been fortunate enough to spend a couple of weeks on leave with his family. However, he'd also known that come January, the ops tempo at SOCOM was going to go through the roof. During the month of December, the command had been charged with figuring out how they were going to disrupt and attack the UN forces operating across the border in Canada and Mexico. However, when close to 20% of the active duty military went AWOL and crossed over to the rebel forces in Canada, the strain on the Special Forces community increased dramatically. SOF was sadly not immune to the crossovers either. Fortunately, the percentage of Special Forces going AWOL didn't exceed 10%. But the fact that 10% of America's most elite warriors had joined the ranks of the enemy still stung. It didn't help that a former JSOC and SOCOM commander had joined the Tate administration as his new Secretary of Defense. His appeal to the SOF community had netted them a few thousand operators from across the 4 branches of service. Most of the SOF that crossed over had come from the ranks of the Naval Special Warfare Groups, and some had been Marines. When Seth had reported into work at 0700 hours the day after New Year's, he'd learned of the early morning attack on the carrier USS Nimitz. He'd fully expected the UN forces to respond. A little over a week later, when the carriers Truman and Stennis had been attacked, General Royal, the SOCOM commander, had immediately issued attack orders to the various Army and Marine Special Forces units that had already crossed into Canada. As Seth walked into the command center that morning, he saw his boss, General Royal, in a heated discussion with one of the operations officers about something, and made his way over to see what was going on. "What do you mean one of our teams has gone missing?" Royal demanded angrily. "Were they captured or killed, or did they just decide to go AWOL as a team?" "We've tasked a drone with trying to get eyes on their last location," the colonel responded. "They had reported receipt of the attack order and were moving to proceed with dropping the U.S. side of the Ogdensburg-Prescott Bridge. It's possible the UN had their own SOF team on our side of the border, ready to interdict our guys. We know the UN had forces there, and they would need to capture that side if they were going to cross into upstate New York." General Royal shook his head in frustration. "Tell me our other operations are at least going well," he demanded. The colonel smiled and nodded. "They are. One of the A-teams just ambushed a convoy of French soldiers headed to the Thousand Islands Bridge, just north of Fort Drum. 2 more teams engaged a German column trying to cross into Vermont from Stansted, Quebec." "What about the air bases?" asked Royal. "I've got the Pentagon all over us about putting them out of commission ASAP." 2 of the ODA teams reported solid hits on the Canadian air bases at Trenton and Kingston, replied the colonel. "The bases won't be down for long,
but it should give the Air Force enough time to hit them with a much larger strike." "Okay, good enough," said Royal with a sigh. "Tell the other teams to keep the pressure up and keep those intel reports coming in." His conversation with the colonel complete, General Royal turned around to move to his next task and realized that Seth was standing next to him. "Your bags packed and ready?" he asked. Seth nodded. "Yes, sir. Just point me where you want me and tell me what you want me to do. I'm ready." General Royal signaled for Seth to follow him back to his side office. After a short walk, Seth closed the door and they both sat down. "All right, Colonel, here's the deal," General Royal began. "I know you want in on the action now that we're in a shooting war with this UN force. However, I've been tasked with a special mission by Homeland Security, and I've selected you to handle it for me. We're going to set up a training facility at the Florida Army National Guard Base. The SecDef has directed us to work with DHS to help them to get this new Homeland Security force up and running. So we're going to use the Camp Blanding Joint Training Center to begin preparing it to receive new recruits so we can get this program up and running." Seth leaned forward. There was a small part of him that thought he must be one lucky SOB to get to stay in Florida, but the Special Forces side of him was highly disappointed to have such an anticlimactic assignment. In light of all the civil unrest that's been spreading across the country, the DHS director, Patricia Hogan, recommended to the President and the SecDef that they create this new national security force to augment the local civilian governments across the country. This was decided a few weeks ago, but we were just officially tasked with implementing it as of 2 days ago. This will free the National Guard units up for federal service, especially now that hostilities have started. I'm going to task you and a few other officers and senior NCOs with getting this new force ready." General Royal held a hand up to forestall any comments from Seth.
"Before you ask, this mission has been specifically handed down to SOF. This is essentially exactly what we train indigenous forces to do, so this makes it an ideal SOF mission."
Right now, nearly all of our teams are deployed to support our conventional forces in the north and south of the country. That means I have to peel off guys from our headquarters group to meet this need. Now, I've been told Homeland wants to grow this force to around 100,000 personnel. I have no idea what they plan on using them for when the crisis is ended, but for the moment, we have too many of our National Guard units tied down with providing protection of critical infrastructure facilities and supporting local law enforcement. The regular Army needs their combat power, and we've been tasked with getting this force trained up so they can be freed for Big Army to use. The general sighed briefly before he continued. "You're going to have about 2 days to get things ready at the base before your first batch of recruits will start to show up. They've already received 7 days' worth of initial training, medical in-processing, uniforms, and all that other admin stuff from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. So when they do arrive, they'll be ready to begin your training without delay." Seth finally interjected to ask, "What kind of training are we supposed to provide these guys if they're going to be used in a civilian law enforcement capacity?" Grunting at the question, General Royal replied, "You'll be responsible for providing these guys with basic rifle and pistol marksmanship and training them how to properly guard a facility and defend it against an attack. It's basically a shortened 4-week version of basic combat training, with the exception that instead of military history, drill and ceremony, and other stuff we teach raw recruits, you'll be focusing on making sure they have the basic skills needed to defend themselves, their comrades, and whatever it is they're assigned to protect. There will be a detachment of Homeland Security law enforcement instructors who will handle a lot of the classroom and admin functions for you. You'll basically have charge of the recruits for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, while Homeland has charge of them for 6 hours a day, 7 days a week. General Royal could see the frustrated look of disappointment on Seth's face at this new assignment. The general paused for a moment before adding, "It's a safe gig, Seth, away from the fighting. You did a good job for me in Kosovo, so I wanted to throw you a bone and help keep you out of harm's way. Plus, I need some good officers to help whip this group into something useful." Seth thought about it for a moment. He'd nearly been killed in Kosovo, and he was at the tail end of his career. No one wanted to get killed in their last year of military service before they retired if they could avoid it. Seeing he didn't have much choice with the assignment, he figured he'd try and make the best of it. "Okay, sir, I can handle this," he responded. "We'll get this group ready for whatever assignment Homeland gives them." With his new marching orders, Seth got his affairs in order at work and back home before he headed off to Camp Blanding, which was located just south of Jacksonville in the northern part of the state.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.